everyone. This is Arabella from Arabella's Voice Studio here. Excited to be starting our second episode in our podcast series, Piano for the Vocalist. Today, we'll be joined by Dr. Hubert Ho. Dr. Ho's music has been played in venues such as Carnegie Hall and the Kennedy Center. He's also actively performed all over the world, including the Czech Republic and France. His educational background includes a degree in music composition, music theory, and also music and physics. So really interesting intersections between music and what makes music work. On a personal note, I have to attribute a lot of my own success to Dr. Ho and what I learned in his class. I took 2 with him in Northeastern in my undergrad, Fundamentals of Music Theory and Music Theory 1. I had a working knowledge of instruments before I came to Dr. Ho's class, but the why and the what I really fortified in those couple of semesters with him. So a big thank you to him for that knowledge and the ability to share it with others, and also for joining us for today's episode. Alongside of that, Dr. Ho has a lot of compositional work out himself, arrangement work out himself, and continues to teach. So what did I miss? Fill us in.
I'm also a pianist. That's my background is from playing piano. And I also play ultimate frisbee recreationally. But yeah, I do a wide variety of things. Music theory, instruction at the university, at Northeastern University, where you're at, and also active still as a composer and a pianist. And also the background you see, this is the logo for Dinosaur Annex Music Ensemble. We just had our second concert of our 50th anniversary season about 2 nights ago. As of this recording. So that's been a really exciting and wild ride to try to put together concerts that look back to the past and also look to the future of new music. So
I really like that. And thanks for filling in some of the gaps there. Whenever I do those introductions, I'm like, I have my perspective of knowing you and what you have brought to life for me, but there's always so much to the person. So thank you for that. So tell us a little bit about what got you into piano in the first place?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on the podcast. I started pretty young. My parents mentioned that I had taken some interest to getting into the piano and going to sit through concerts at a pretty young age, and so they started me with lessons, and then I then proceeded to do other instruments as well, violin 3 years afterwards. So I started with piano at age 5. And then violin at age 8. And then I started composing also on my own around that same time, but then I also took some lessons afterwards.
Awesome. So a really diverse background in music. So being an instrumentalist, multi-instrumentalist myself, what kept you going on the piano? Because one thing I struggle with is I think about instruments bringing different things to the table. Like I have so much rhythm knowledge from the guitar, harmony knowledge from the piano. But what attracted you to the piano and to stick with it?
I think for me, it was the excitement of getting to learn to play new pieces and to explore new sounds with new pieces. So anytime anyone or I learn a piece, it takes a little bit of time just to get used to that particular piece. But then once you start playing it and once we start practicing it through, I think what I found out is that there are all these connections that could be made between various parts of the piece. And so I relished in those connections, finding them and, trying to make things better. To be honest, in my early years, especially just like many other kids in the world, practicing is hard. It's hard to get a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old person to, sit somewhere and have to drill and repeat and try to get something really good just by listening and being focused and those are really challenging things. And so if I look back at my younger self, I probably would say, I really wish I would have practiced a little more here and there. But then I think later in life, then I started doing shows or doing concerts or doing piano competitions, and then the requirement is just to try to get disciplined early enough, because you don't want to go on stage unprepared. And if it's 2 days before the concert and you're not prepared, then and you start to realize that, hey, I really should have prepared a little bit more in advance. So
absolutely. I full-heartedly say that I still struggle to practice as an adult, even though I have I think, strategies and techniques now in place and maybe a little bit more maturity than when I was playing at 5, 6, as you were saying. But it's hard to practice. And so bringing it to your teaching experience, because I like to make the podcast too philosophical, but also very practical for the listener. How do you encourage students, especially at the college level, who maybe have not had a routine of practicing? How do you introduce that to them as like, it's more than just music, it's about learning to learn?
It really depends on the particular student, particular, it depends on what their goals are as well. If it's really just, to, just like take some time away from their STEM studies, if they're in STEM, then it's maybe, I actually find that in those cases, sometimes those learners are more motivated because they know that once they're done with that, then they're going back to, their work with the other classes. The part about developing a routine is it can be a little complicated, not super complicated, but I think just realizing that certain routines are good and certain routines are not so helpful is a good first step, right? I mean, there's this idea that I think sometimes, if you're just kind of sitting in the practice room and you're, playing and, playing and somehow this idea that you just kind of play like 3 hours, 4 hours straight, that's going to help you get further, and it may to some extent, but it may not be the most efficient. All right, so I think efficient practice is key here, and by efficient practice, there are a couple of efficiencies that one can use. So for one thing, I try to get students when they're doing piano exercises take rest, right? Frankly, so every 30 minutes, just take a 3-minute rest, whether it be a water or a restroom or even just playing on social media or anything. Just take some rest in order to get refreshed, because cognitively we will tire out after being at the piano for that long. And it may not be 30 minutes, 3 minutes every 30 minutes. It could be, say, if it's better for you, 5 minutes for every 60 minutes. And of course, this is important too for physiological reasons. You do want to have good habits to avoid other things down the line, like tendonitis and repetitive strain injury and so forth. I think a balance between like practice, sort of the technique practice, working on whether it's scales or chords or double thirds or, just working on those things and then moving on to repertoire. I think that's something that people could think intentionally on how they want to balance working on sort of basic skills and working on more applied literature. So I think there are various things that people can do too.
Do you think that time frame changes? For instance, I like to use percentages. Like if we think of an hour lesson being as 100%, do you think of like a beginner lesson being 60% technique, 40% application, or maybe an intermediate being 50-50? I'm making up these numbers, but do you have that kind of formula at the back of your mind, or is it just super person dependent?
I think it's super person dependent, and I think it also depends on the goals of the particular person or the particular project they're working on. There are certain techniques that you want to do in preparation for certain pieces, right? So if there are certain pieces where you're doing a lot of octave technique, then maybe it's good to just, get some octaves down earlier on before trying to attempt those pieces. There's also like this in between. I've been making a binary between really rudimentary exercises, the things you find in like Hanon or those exercises that we learn as part of our routine, and also do the repertoire. But I think there's also this middle ground, right? So there are times when there are really difficult passages in the piece you're learning, and sometimes it's just really useful to drill those particular passages, do it slowly, do it in rhythm, and then work it up to tempo. And I mean, that's a type of drill practice that can be really helpful as well.
And just to rephrase for the listeners as well, the 3 takeaways that I'm hearing from our conversation so far is routine is helpful, but practice is individual, and having an efficient practice schedule is really instrumental for the person. So efficiency, routine, and knowing yourself are the 3 takeaways that I have there.
Yeah, one thing I'll add to the bit about the efficiency is the mind. So having a mindset where you're actually thinking through the things you're doing will be really useful, right? Sometimes when I see, young learners or learners that are not super familiar with instrumental practice routines, one thing I see is that, they'll kind of start repeating stuff over and over again, but then you kind of know that their mind has gone somewhere, like, what's for dinner. you kind of notice. So I think just trying to, every time you're making a motion on the piano or whatever instrument, every time you're making a motion on the piano or actually doing something and you're actually playing through, like, ask yourself, like, what am I trying to do here? Am I trying to connect the notes? Am I trying to hit this upper note? Am I trying to voice the fifth finger more than the first finger? And then of course, maybe there are larger questions about the musical material. Is this part of a longer phrase? Is it part of a shorter phrase? Am I trying to build the shorter phrases to build up to the longer phrases? And that kind of intentionality in the thinking, that kind of mental practice, becomes as important as the physical practice. I know there are colleagues and friends of mine in the musical world. They do mental practice a lot, actually, just looking at pieces, looking at scores, if it's score-based music, and then trying to figure out what the scores are trying to say. So there's that type of mental practice. And then there's also the ghost playing mental practice, right? So even if you're not at the instrument, you can be looking at the score. Then you're kind of in your own thoughts, but you're still making the motions. So I can make the motions while I look at the score, and then I can kind of think about what the music needs. I think those are other things that just helped with the intentionality of doing the musical work, and then we end up making more meaningful practice, which leads to more meaningful musical results in performance.
Sure. And one thing that I have really valued in what we've brought to students, and something I think that they've wanted, is this idea of musical independency. Practicing in a way so that you can become independent. I always tell students, make me irrelevant. Make me sort of the backup plan. And of course, your teacher won't be irrelevant in that hopefully they're always bringing something new to the table, but in that encouragement of take the idea, there's a difference between learning and practicing. And I think that's what I try to emphasize is learning the material may or may not take as much time as it does to practice the material. And that independent part of, I will sit down and practice, I will find the best way for me, is crucial in growth, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Putting that independency to yourself, I think once over the years, we find that we start thinking through what the teachers told us, not merely in the content of what they told us, but in the reasoning behind what they told us, right? So in the educational research world, which is a world that I sometimes explore with reference to pedagogical work in the theory classroom, they use this word metacognition a lot, right? So just understanding what the reasoning is behind something, behind doing it. And then when you get to the point in certain years later, you can think, oh, okay, well, what they were doing is they were trying to get me to make these connections, and I can categorize those various actions in that same super category. And so you start organizing your kind of processes in a way that maybe you didn't realize when you first got exposed to that particular teaching.
I'd love to shift gears slightly, but not really, because I think this all relates. So I'd love to ask you a little bit about your work and how that's affected the way that you think about either music or the way you teach. And particularly, I was really interested as I was sort of rereading your bio and thinking back to your own lessons. You have this wonderful understanding between the intersection of math and music, or the structure behind music. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, absolutely, yeah. So I think one of the nice things about having a background in creating the music and also playing the music is that we're able to provide reasons for why the music is written the way it is, or find out or try to double back or analyze the reasons for the way the music is. And then my philosophy, among many others' philosophies, is, my goal when I'm playing a piece is to reflect that particular mission of that particular piece, right? So, or the mission or the statements that are embedded within the piece. Yes, anyone can play the notes, they can play the rhythms, they can play the dynamics, they can make something artistic sounding, right? They can make phrases, they could close phrases, they could emphasize particular voices. But I think having a music theory background helps one or put in motion some of those ideas into a context that allows the listener then to see the piece on maybe a broader scale, or understand particular particular values that are embedded in the piece that you may not have noticed before you were analyzing the piece. So I think that's one of the nicest things about a theory study, is that it's not just something that's on pen and paper. It's something that's meant to be represented and embodied into the acoustical universe once it becomes practiced and performed and made into real sound. Now, on the question of math and music, so that's another level. On some level, that's maybe on some level that's a little more abstract on the one hand. But on the other hand, I think what I teach a math and music course at Northeastern, and one of the things we do is we listen to various pieces that are applications of these very basic mathematical structures. They're not even that complex structures, and we kind of try to figure out why they might be relevant. And so that can be applied to many different types of musics, and it might give us insights that traditional music theory doesn't. So that's kind of where that comes in.
I wasn't lucky enough to take that class. I always wanted to, because it sounds great. And yeah. I tell people I'm a functional math person. Like, economics, great. Statistics, great. As soon as you put a chart in front of me and you ask me to find the meaning in front of it, I sort of struggle. So I thought that would be a nice intersection there. But, maybe next time.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, the literature is out there. I mean, they're in libraries, and so yeah, it's worth. And of course, some of my colleagues, some of them who wrote some of the books that I use as textbooks in the class, friends and colleagues, they've written a lot, and you might find like a YouTube video or some lecture that they happen to give to either a professional society or sometimes they're community groups that are interested in this stuff. So they're always really interesting ways to connect with that material.
I'll have to do some further exploration or reach out again after the podcast. But so here's a question for you, and more to the point of what you were saying about insight. So I go back to the curtain is blue scenario is how I think about it in English class, when they're like, the curtain is blue, so the person must be sad. And all the English students are sitting there like, well, are they really sad, or is the curtain just blue? And I think about that sometimes with music too. What is the line there between going too far and it's just a theory, or that theory can really help you be creative and apply common structures to make things easier? I think it's a really fine line. So,
yeah, I mean, there are people who really work deeply on this question intersecting music theory and performance, and so I think they're oftentimes asking that. It really boils down to a number of things, but maybe I'll start with feedback, right? So just, thinking about the particular structures, I mean, we can work on it in charts or on paper, so to speak. And then when we actually bring it to the piano or bring it to a live performance, then we really test it out. Like, hey, am I trying this particular passage? And I'm, elucidating some kind of line or some particular notes. And then the question is, well, does it, make sense to elucidate those particular embedded theories? And if it does, then it does. And if it doesn't, then maybe it's more of a speculative theory, or it may have different purposes. It may not have a purpose that's directly tied towards performance. I also think that sometimes it's just good to look at a piece outside of the keyboard and then realize that, well, actually, I didn't even know that it was there. So just discovering something that's embedded in the piece outside of the keyboard and the fingers, and then realizing that there's something in that particular piece. And then when you go to the keyboard, then you're, aha, like if I hadn't actually done the work outside the keyboard to find that particular thing, then I wouldn't have found that knowledge, and I wouldn't have been able to realize, that's what's going on. Right?
Yeah, sort of to your point of, you don't actually have to be sitting at the instrument. And maybe sometimes it's better if you're not sitting at the instrument to still be working on music, sort of bringing that back full circle. So I'd love to ask you a little bit about your compositional work. I listened to a piece in preparation for this, but I know that you have sort of many out there, so I would have to become more versed in it. But how do you think about expanding from the piano to incorporate more instruments in? Do you think about it still in that, I say linear way because the piano is laid out in a linear fashion, or do you think about it as sections?
A little of everything. That was one of the big questions when we grow up on an instrument. Do we think through the instrument and through the bodily mechanisms required to produce sound, or do we think sonically and then try to find the bodily mechanisms that are necessary to produce those sounds? I have experience on the string instruments. I have more limited experience with wind instruments, so I'm there like relying on my education in orchestration classes, instrumentation classes, talking to friends and colleagues who are clarinet players or flute players. The same thing for brass instruments as well. But I am referencing different types of knowledge in order to try to create a sound as a composer. I'm usually thinking about the sounds that I want to put and how to put them together. So I'm not necessarily thinking linearly. I'm usually thinking gesturally, right? So in other words, I'm thinking, hey, this is this particular big sound, and I want the smaller sound, and I want to have these other lines that come in, right? And then my goal is to try to figure out how to put them together in a way that the instruments can play them in a way that makes sense for the whole piece, right? So it's a bit back and forth between having an idea and then trying to execute the idea. And then on the other hand, knowing what instruments you're working with, just mentally trying to figure out, well, what type of sounds I want to create there, and then seeing if I can put those into a more unique or a meaningful structure. So it kind of goes both ways when you're writing music. But I'm not one of the people who writes music at the keyboard. Sometimes nowadays, I might be at some I might be using some technology, right? And it may not be, it's not like I'm at a DAW. I don't use DAWs in my own work sequencers in my own work, but I might be interested in a particular process, right? So like some sort of timbral transformation. So the type of sound moving to another type of sound, for example. And there might be something that I might hear in, say some sort of technology. I could be using any number of tech tools, like let's say Max MSP, which is a program that's oftentimes people use in the computer music world. I might be using that to try to figure out, well, how might I do something very similar in the instrumental world? I might be using particular pitch collections. So let's say I'm using 014, 013, or if I'm using, some sort of some collection of scales or pitch-based collections, and trying to sort of manipulate them and trying to figure out, what sort of things work as material. And then once I do that, then I would build off those particular materials. So yeah, it really sort of it kind of depends. I think when I was younger, just kind of going through schooling, I would be much more fastidious in terms of like making sure I have all the pitches I needed before I moved to the next section, and having a lot of these what we call pre-compositional procedures. As I grow older, I'm a little less strict on having a certain pre-compositional procedure before actually writing the piece. But I think hopefully by this time I have a lot of those structures embedded in the back of my head while I'm actually writing the piece. So it's a different series of creative processes that work at once.
Yeah, and I really like the word you use, gesture, what the gesture of the piece is. Very common scenario. We have students come in who say, I'm here because I know I have to work on singing/piano. I'm here because I know I need to work on some music theory. But really, at the end of the day, I just want to write music. Like, I'm here to write songs. And my take on that is, well, learn all this stuff because one, it's good to learn. It's never going to hurt you. But two, just start writing, right? Because I think, and you said this actually, and I believe our fundamental music theory class, where sometimes not having all the knowledge too, you have not better pieces, but you have more central idea, you have robustness in what you're producing because you're not bogged down with some of the structures that we were talking about. So the idea of both of, yes, it's good to learn this stuff because it's going to yield more creative choices for you, but also start writing, start doing the thing, because why learn theory if there's no practical application? Why learn to sing and play piano if you're never going to perform?
Absolutely. Understanding that those particular structures that you're learning are really tied to specific times and places, right? And the types of music that people are writing on their own or nowadays, or just developing your own musical language. I think part of what's exciting is that, you get to then try to figure out what your particular set of rules and structures you want to use in your music will be, right? So I like to tell our first years in the first year class that, well, you know, there are certain musics that use these particular sets of scripts or principles, and when you're writing your own music, then you're going to be borrowing from that or leveraging some of that background, but you're also going to be incorporating some tendencies that you're going to use. And then people are going to write music theory books based on your music, right? So I think there's a bit of a feedback loop in thinking about, well, we're drawing a lot of musical content from our cultural backgrounds, our knowledge of music in the past, and at the same time, you're creating something new, and therefore you are then therefore contributing to the cultural base on which future music theories will be born.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of jazz. From my understanding and learning of it, is a lot of the rules that we have for jazz as we teach them now came from someone experimenting. So I would just leave the listener with a thought of, I always encourage people to learn music, but also play music. And I think those are synonyms. And that's, I think, for the listener to decide.
I think jazz is a rich vocabulary. I'm not a jazz specialist per se, although as you remember, we do use jazz examples in our classes. And I think what's fascinating is, of course, with jazz you have the improvisational aspect, and you're bringing in all the notes that are outside of the mode or outside of the scale and outside of the key, and bringing them into the key, and it is a somewhat different process, I think. In ways in which we're trying to improvise and bring out particular sounds at the moment, or particular musical melodic or harmonic structures at the moment. But there is this really great interplay, I think, between what we hear and then the types of thoughts that we have about the music. I always like to encourage the people who don't do written music to actually do more written music, and then the people who grew up in a strictly classical tradition, I always encourage them to try to venture out into non-notated music, whether it be jazz or even using lead sheet in pop rock. I think it's interesting, having taught, I don't know, like the first class I taught music theory as a graduate student instructor was about 25 years, I think about 25, 26 years ago. So it's been a while. And, just seeing, how different students react to different musical materials, I always see that sometimes the person who's done a lot of classical music, they're really great at the scores, but, you get them and say, hey, just noodle around on the C major scale and do a melody, they get a little scared. And then vice versa, there are those who are very comfortable, playing chord progressions on the piano, and then, you put a score in front of them, they're scared. So I always encourage everyone to do a little of the thing that they're not as comfortable with, and I think that can actually help them grow a lot.
I love that, and I think that's about as practical a tip as you can get. Do the thing that you don't know how to do yet. Have the rest in your toolbox, but keep going. And along those lines, I'll wrap us up here with two final questions. You have given so many practical tips throughout today, but if you were to leave the listener with one final thing of something instrumentally practical, or just to think about practically, what would that be?
I'll think about something specific. I mean, I might have ideas on the more broad, but I think there's always that tendency going back to, because I think your listeners are thinking about practice and thinking about, getting better, right? Trying to improve. One of the things one can do is really just focus on the thing that is the struggling part, right? And so oftentimes, I can hear this just down the halls in the practice rooms at the university. You can, they're just like, they're practicing the part that's they're practicing the 10-second phrase, but the part that they really need work on is the last second, right? So, what you want to do is you just want to make sure you do that last second over and over again. And then you can also connect that to like the next 5 seconds. So you can connect that, let's say that you're really struggling on the 9th and the 10th seconds. So let's say that's like the end of the phrase. And then and then you have this next beginning of the phrase. You can sort of loop those together after you sort of just focus on those 2 seconds and then move it to the next 2 seconds. There's no reason to do the first 8 seconds because that's great. And of course, our tendencies are that, I can sound, like Chopin, I can hear those chords and it's like, yeah, it sounds really great. And then, you're sort of struggling through the last 2 seconds and then you go back to second one. But just if you're focusing, by the way, I think psychologists call this chunking, just hearing these various bits, and then, just trying to get those bits together and adding bigger bits in order to group them all together so that they're one unit. And so once you really focus on the thing that's really giving you the struggle, then you can start incorporating that into the things that are giving you less struggle. And then those particular connections can then be made. And then you can sort of add bits that are that you don't normally group together. So maybe you never really practice going from second 8 to second 12. But then after you've solidified seconds 9 and 10, you can go back to 1 through 10. That's fine. But also try to do second 8 through 12 because you haven't demonstrated that you can actually move to that next bit. And then once you practice that, then everything will start coming together.
Yes. And to bring it back to the instrument too, I always think it's much harder, but maybe a better skill to be able to pick something up mid-measure or the pickup beat into the next measure, because it shows that you can isolate the concept and keep going. And if you can do it in isolation, as you were saying, then putting it in the whole is going to be much easier versus I think when we go from beginning to end, we have two tendencies. One is, well, this sounds great in the whole of it, so I'm not going to worry about it. Or two, we get stuck on the thing that's not going so right. And we're not working on it. We're just stuck on it. We hear it, like it sticks out like a sore thumb to us. But of course, if you keep pressing the same buttons, you get the same results.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then final question here to bring it back to you and some of the great work that you've done. Where can we find some of the compositions and pieces that you've put out? Is there anything exciting coming up that we should be aware of and looking out for?
Yeah, I mean, I've been working on a few things here and there. I do have a website. It's on a WordPress site, so people can kind of look at that. And then people can also look at my SoundCloud page. I think it's HH Music. I actually can't quite remember at the moment, but if you want to hyperlink it in the comments and
we can
wherever
put
you
it,
post that, just put it
either up on the screen or in the comments, so people definitely find those.
So there's some good work there, and then just in terms of projects, I've been thinking a lot about microtonality in part because of the type of work I'm doing with students in music and math. So I'm thinking about projects related to try to get microtonality going a little more in my own ears, and then seeing if I can try to create music that way. I've been sort of, continuously working on piano music myself because I am a pianist myself. So I've been doing some work there, and I've been, doing a lot of administrative and also curatorial work with Dinosaur Annex since this is our 50th season. So that, that takes up a lot of effort and time, but it's really well worth it because it's really about community building. Yeah, I look forward to sharing more of those projects with you and your listeners. So.
I'm sure it's a lot of work, but as a listener, I can say well worth it to be able to listen to it and experience that with you. So thank you. And thank you for your time. For the listeners out there, I just have to say something really specific to my playing. I knew how to play my scales on piano before coming into Dr. Ho's class, but my knowledge of how to implement those scales in a really functional way came to light after that class. So I always think about that being as a tipping point in my own music education, and even the way I teach people now. So thank you for a number of reasons, but thank you for setting me up for that and for allowing me to share that with others and coming on here today and sharing just a little bit more.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to hear that. Yes, and we're all very proud of you and what you've been doing in musical and then of course in your own work. So yes, thanks for having me on the podcast. It's really a nice pleasure to speak with you and to reconnect, and hopefully your listeners can get something out of this.
And we'll be back next time with more.